In sooth, I know not why I am so sad. I know not why I am so sad. It wearies me. You say it wearies you. You say it wearies you. But how I caught it, found it, or came by it, what stuff 'tis made of, whereof it is born, I am to learn. And such a want-wit sadness makes of me that I have much ado to know myself.
John, I'd like to petition for a while SHYLOCKE and begin by asking you about this love triangle that, after all, is the occasion for the borrowing and the lending that brings SHYLOCKE into his catastrophic day in court. And I want to begin by asking you about Antonio.
I know not why I am so sad. It wearies me. You say it wearies you. But how I caught it, found it, or came by it, what stuff 'tis made of, whereof it is born, I am to learn. And such a want-wit sadness makes of me that I have much ado to know myself.
The way that I read Antonio is that despite what he says at the start, in sooth, I know not why I am so sad, his cronies suggest that it's concern about his merchandise. He shrugs that off. Well, then you must be in love, fi. It's not that either. I really need to get to know myself. The world is a stage and every man plays a part, and my part is that I'm sad. I don't believe a word of that. Everything that he says to Bassanio, everything that is said about Antonio and his connection to Bassanio suggests to me that this is a man who is deeply, desperately, unrequitedly in love with Bassanio. Am I off the mark in that?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that the language of the play bears out. Well, I mean, I do agree when you say that he's lying. But I think there's a number of possible explanations for that. And one is when it's suggested to him that he's upset because his merchandise is all at risk. He lies about that. So I think that one reading, because the very last we hear of Antonio, at the very end of the play, he appears to be happy. And he appears to be happy when he learns that some of his merchandise is safe. So I think one reading of the play is it's about the different schemes of value that are in contradiction with each other because of the development of commerce and capitalism in London at the time. London's a commercial city, and the scheme of value that looks at human beings for their virtue, for their individual value as individuals, is coming up against a scheme of value that is monetary. And so one way of understanding Antonio's depression is to see him as the kind of modern alienated subject in capitalism, right? That he is subject to all these economic forces beyond his control, and therefore he is upset that his merchandise is at stake, and he doesn't know himself because as the merchant of the play, it's not SHYLOCKE, it's actually Antonio is the merchant of the title. Doesn't know himself because his activity has been directed towards enriching himself. And so we could see it in those terms as a kind of fable even of modern capitalism, right? Of the person who devotes his energies to the making of wealth and not to the cultivation of self-knowledge. So I think that's one way of understanding it, that Antonio is dishonest, he is upset, about his merchandise being at stake, and maybe he doesn't know exactly why he's depressed, but his apparent happiness, the very last line we hear from him, may signal that he's lying about that, and in fact, it is not just his merchandise at stake, but the way that one of the things that Shakespeare is addressing here is that the way that the kind of scheme of values that was dominant in the medieval period, right, where people, even the lord of the manor and the serf, shared a common scheme of, let's say, Christian values, right, that with the development of modern capitalism, the only thing that holds people together is, as Marx puts it so eloquently in the Communist Manifesto, callous cash payment. As Marx puts it, capitalism drowns everything in the icy waters of egotistical calculation, and that therefore Antonio is that alienated modern subject of capitalism. I think that's one reading.
Believe me, no. I thank my fortune for it. My ventures are not in one bottom trusted, nor to one place, nor is my whole estate upon the fortune of this present year. Therefore, my merchandise makes me not sad.
I don't discount, however, the reading that Antonio is in love with Bassanio, and that it can't be requited. He can't acknowledge it. It's something that he can never admit to, right? Because of the attitude towards homosexuality in Shakespeare's time, he can never acknowledge these kinds of longings, and that because he loves his friend Bassanio, he would rather do anything he can to have Bassanio achieve his desires. There's a kind of selfless, disinterested aspect, even though it's very interested, right? But he tries to take the approach of a disinterested love for Bassanio. If he can't consummate that desire with Bassanio, at least he can facilitate the relationship between Portia and Bassanio, and in some way vicariously gain happiness by seeing his friend gain happiness. I think that's a plausible interpretation as well.
Early on, Antonio says, my purse, my person, my extremest means lie all unlocked to your occasions. So money and essentially his own being, his soul, his emotions, his love, he's connecting the two. A few years later, we will be hearing Polonius advising his son Laertes, neither a borrower nor a lender be. Here we have borrowing and lending, and it's even more complicated than that. It's all tied up with love and friendship and emotion. That can't be a good combination.
No, it isn't. I mean, I think even the way Bassanio asks Antonio for the money is perfect, because he talks around it, right? He launches into this long, elaborate speech. Antonio, whatever his feelings are for Bassanio, right, whether they're fundamentally erotic or platonic, right, or just the bonds of friendship, he knows what Bassanio's up to.
And he stops him,
And he
right?
stops him. He says, "Cut it. You don't need to
Call off your dog.
Yeah, you don't need to." He tells him, "Stop being so wordy." Essentially, is what he says to him, and he says, "Just cut to the chase." And then he tells him, "My money's at your disposal." Right. So Bassanio at least feels like he has to talk around the subject. There's this wonderful little description that Bassanio gives about the metaphor of shooting the arrow once and missing, and then he'll follow it the second time with even greater care. He's already borrowed money from Antonio, and he hasn't paid it back yet. And he's asking for more. Hence the elaborate wordiness of how he'll follow the arrow this time and gain back both, which is true, of course, if he is successful with Portia, right? Who's not just the object of his desire, but is actually an object that at the same time will make him wealthy.
What's so funny about that scene is that Antonio, being a merchant, he's trained to recognize a fudge.
He sees it right away.
But listen to what Antonio has to say later on. Lorenzo basically says, no. Antonio understands that to make a plea to the Duke, to petition him to invalidate this bond, would impeach the freedom of the state. That phrase is repeated again later by Antonio. We must not impeach the justice of the state. And then we hear that also from Shylock. They're all at the same thing, which is that Venice is a world trade center. It's an interzone for merchants, and they need to know the letter of the law is trustworthy.
Not because their highest value is justice, so that their highest value is law. It's that their highest value is commerce. Right. That's and Shylock knows that the bond cannot be violated because it's a center of commerce. So here's another place where we actually see moral bonds superseded by economic imperatives, which is, I think, one of the main themes of the play. Is it that Antonio, when his life is at stake, values the state and commerce higher than he does his life?
I don't think so.
I think that's hardly something that would be valuable enough to him. I think one interpretation is, in fact, that it's his affection for Bassanio and his love for him that leads him to want to sacrifice himself for Bassanio.
He doesn't even hire an attorney. He doesn't even have a representative. And so when Salanio is talking about his relationship to Bassanio, he says, I think he only loves the world for him. I'm wondering, is there an aspect about Antonio, as you were suggesting, it looks as if I'm never going to have him. And if that's the case, if I can't give my heart to him completely, if we can't be together, then I don't necessarily need the heart. What will it do for me? Where will I go with it? How will I live? I mean, at the end, he says the ripest fruit are the ones that are ready to fall off. Live still and write mine epitaph. Say how I loved you. I won't say eager, but he seems almost contented to be sacrificing himself.
Well, he's certainly not trying to save himself very much, right?
He doesn't do anything.
Yeah, he doesn't do anything to save himself. Although the interesting thing is that at that moment, Bassanio has already chosen the right casket, right? So what that means is that he doesn't have to sacrifice himself for Bassanio to attain Portia. Bassanio already has, right? So maybe it's just a despair at not having any place because Bassanio is with Portia. You know, I think it wouldn't quite be a sacrifice so much as it would be just a giving up on life because he doesn't think he has any place in the world, right? He talks about how, you know, he's has a place in the world, but it's a sad one. But now maybe if we follow the argument that it's really his love for Bassanio that has led him into this sadness and depression, that, you know, maybe he's given up because he's lost his love. That's plausible. He doesn't try very hard.
No.
My love for you will be unrequited, right? But at least you'll see me having died and made this kind of sacrifice for your sake, and you'll remember me. Maybe even feel guilty, right, about it as well. Bassanio doesn't seem to evince any guilt about having put Antonio in this position. None that I can recall in the play. I mean, he does want to help him. He does want to save him. And Portia immediately leaps to his aid in doing that. I mean, once he hears the position that Antonio is in, he immediately acts, right? But he's really been responsible for putting him in this position.
How much of a case can we make against Bassanio as a gold digger who is pursuing Portia as much for her wealth, and I mean, she basically presides over a kingdom, this Belmonte. It's not just a mansion. As much for that as for her looks, her character, whatever other virtues. He does even say to Antonio, look, I'm going to pay all of this back if this works out for me. And Shakespeare's always planting clues, isn't he?
Well, the metaphor of the arrow, right? I'll get back both what you owe me already plus, right? He's already has in mind, he knows that Portia's wealthy, right? And he doesn't have any money himself. So her wealth solves the problems that all the characters have who don't have wealth, right? They're immediately wealthy. Portia's also presented as being virtuous, but there are things that undercut it, I think all the Christians in the play are ironically undercut. I think one of the ways of reading the play is that Shakespeare is exposing their hypocrisy throughout in interesting ways. So Portia undoubtedly is presented as being virtuous, but she's also deceptive. She disguises herself. She doesn't reveal that deception in the court, right? She only reveals it to Bassanio when he returns, right? She goes through the whole unnecessary deception of the rings, really, although maybe she's testing his fidelity because she does, just because he chose the right casket doesn't mean that he is trustworthy, right? It's not really something that proves that somebody is virtuous. I mean, one of the aspects of the casket exercise is that if you choose the right one, that's supposed to be proof of your virtue, but I don't think that's necessarily persuasive in and of itself. So maybe the ring episode is necessary so that she can demonstrate to herself that he is loyal, that he is faithful. That's one possibility, but I think underneath all of it, for all these characters, they are caught up in commerce. And so one of the ways I think of reading the play is that although Shakespeare presents the Christian characters as having these definitive virtues and that those virtues are counterposed to the villainous attributes of Shylock, right, who has no regard, empathy, concern for others, right, and is caught up entirely in commerce. And the way in which the Christian characters are somehow presented as not being caught up in that game is something that Shakespeare subverts throughout the play, so that one reading of it is that Shylock is a scapegoat, right? He's the means by which the Christians convince themselves that they're not caught up in the hypocrisies of commerce and the contradictions that emerge with their Christian values from participating in that. And so that he becomes the convenient scapegoat so that they can convince themselves that they are virtuous, when I think they're actually not. I think they're often frivolous. I think that if we really look at Bassanio, there's nothing to persuade us in the play that he is somehow in pursuit of Portia's virtue. There's no interior monologue that would persuade us of that. He could just as easily be a gold digger who is in search of her wealth, primarily, to make his fortune. And in fact, one of the metaphors that comes up twice in the play is of Jason and the Golden Fleece. And Jason is an adventurer in search of treasure. It comes up in Act 1, the metaphor of the fleece, and then Portia is explicitly with her golden hair, right, compared to the golden fleece. So she's golden in the sense of her wealth, and she's supposed to be golden in the sense of her virtue, yet the kinds of jokes and knowledge that she has suggests that she has knowledge that a virtuous maid shouldn't have, right? That's certainly, she has a wisdom of the world that suggests that she's not innocent. How if she didn't have knowledge of the world could she argue the case so persuasively, right? She makes a joke in Act 5 with Bassanio about, well, now that you're unfaithful, we're going to be unfaithful ourselves, right? And Bassanio humorously says, we're going to be cuckolds before the marriage is even consummated, right? So how do we account for Portia having that knowledge? I think there are contradictions. She's not so virtuous as she seems, right? None of them are.
The very first thing that we hear from her after she has told Nerissa of this plan to save Antonio, Nerissa says, "Why shall we turn to men?" Meaning, are we going to dress up as men? Mm-hmm. To which Portia answers, "Fie, what a question is that if thou wert near a lewd interpreter?" She couldn't have said that unless she herself is the lewd interpreter.
Right.
Then what is the next thing that she does? As you say, she puts on the equivalent of a pair of trousers, mm-hmm. pretends to be a doctor of laws, which mm-hmm. she's not, mm-hmm. and argues a case in front of the Duke against Shylock mm-hmm. in a court that she has absolutely no qualification to represent herself mm-hmm. in. So this idea of plainness and virtue and virginity in its largest sense, that somehow she's leading this protected existence controlled by her father from the grave. It calls into question how well this little parlor game really is working. And that leads me to a question, which is that why does Shakespeare have this obsession with over-controlling fathers? Romeo and Juliet, their fathers won't let them marry. Polonius turns his daughter Ophelia into a spy against Hamlet. On the island in The Tempest, Prospero puts his daughter to sleep when he wants the conversation to end. He couldn't just say, well, we'll pick it up again tomorrow. He puts her to sleep. Lear treats Cordelia abominably. Even Hamlet's father drives him practically nuts with this plan for revenge. Shylock wants Jessica locked up when he leaves the house. Mm-hmm. And the windows have to be closed in case a mask is parading by. She might see it, they might see her. And then we have Portia's father from the grave trying to control who she marries. This casket thing is like something you'd have seen on Channel 2 at 3 o'clock in the middle of the day. And obviously, whatever Dad is trying to do at that distance from the beyond, clearly it doesn't work.
Yeah, no, it doesn't work at all, because the way I would like to see it played is that, Portia is standing there when the various suitors are choosing the casket. So what's to stop her from misdirecting them when that's happening? I imagine her standing there looking at the suitors and kind of misdirecting them to the casket that's the wrong choice or the right one. I think she cheats. The control of the father from the grave is a farce in this case. She has control. I mean, she knows who she's not interested in. She is pretty astute at assessing the character of the suitors. If you remember in Act 1, I believe it is, there's a long discussion that she has assessing the character of at least 4 or 5 or 6 different suitors, all of different nationalities, all with stereotypical characteristics of those nationalities as well. She's a keen observer, even though they're stereotypical as well, and that could relate in some way to the Shylock story and what Shakespeare wants to do there. But I think that I think she's directing the whole story, and I imagine when they are choosing those caskets, she's misdirecting the folks that she doesn't want to be married to, and that she directs Bassanio correctly. What would it take? A wink, a facial expression to indicate which casket she thinks that they should choose. But as to the question of powerful, overbearing fathers, I think that Shakespeare is aware of the repressive force of patriarchal authority and the suffering that it causes those who are subject to it, particularly women. And I think that he uses that same plot device as a way of showing the way that the exercise of patriarchal authority is destructive to people's lives. And that even in comedy, when it's a perfect conflict device, right? I mean, it works over and over again, right? The father who has his wishes becomes the source or origin of the conflict, but the larger source of the conflict is a patriarchal society that empowers those fathers to have that power over female characters whose desires are thwarted, whose desires are circumscribed, whose desires are repressed by that authority. And I've really come to believe, whatever we might want to call a feminist, whatever that might be, right? It would be anachronistic to call Shakespeare a feminist, but I think that the one thing that he does understand, I believe, and the reason why he puts female characters in these roles where they assume power and are able to wield power, is that I think he recognized that that in order for romantic relationships to flourish and survive and flourish, that there has to be a kind of mutuality and equality in them. And that mutuality and equality cannot exist under the patriarchal relations of Elizabethan England, the society that Shakespeare is in. Maybe they existed in personal relationships between individuals. There's nothing to stop that, right? But and this is often the outcome of the comedies, right? Women by assuming the disguise of men, arrive at some kind of level of empowerment in relationship to their romantic partners that puts them on an equal footing, and that we have to assume that that equal footing survives beyond the scope of the play. So I think that that's often Shakespeare's point, that he has in the comedies this outcome of renewal, this positive outcome, by first establishing these women as being powerful, so that we know even when they revert to the female roles, they're still capable of asserting that equality with their male partners, and consequently that their relationships are capable of flourishing. Right? So I come to understand all of the comedies through that lens.
Well, just imagine Bassanio trying to save Antonio without Portia.
Yeah.
He would have been on his knees and pleading and saying how much he loves him, but he doesn't have a plan. There's no plan.
Yeah, she has the plan. Yeah.
And at the conclusion, you do have this sense that he's not necessarily going to be running things in Belmonte.
Not really.
We've seen him borrowing money and wooing in order to be able to pay it back, and then falling apart when his best buddy is in trouble. She goes right at it.
She's ruled quite well without her father, and has showed herself in moments of conflict to be able to take charge. All right, so I think that puts her on an equal footing with Bassanio. Even, I mean, another thing is that I think Shakespeare understood that, and this, we could talk about this in terms of a lot of things. We could talk about it in terms of divine right, and how legitimate leadership was understood. We could think about it in terms of how power was transferred from father to oldest son. Right? We could talk about all those things as similar, but I think Shakespeare understood that qualities and characteristics of character were not necessarily assigned to people, based on the official structures of power. Right, that women could easily have, and did have, and do have qualities that would be traditionally at the time associated with men. Right, that people could assume the throne, right, because of the rules of accession, who had no ability to lead because of their character and the qualities that they had. All these things Shakespeare consistently calls attention to. Right, that power and how it's institutionalized, and ability to lead, qualities of character, are not necessarily assigned on the basis of a person's position within a hierarchy. And that's true of Portia, it's true of Shylock as well. I think that has to be implicit in how we evaluate that question in the play also, because he's assigned a subordinate role, right, because of how he's perceived. But that doesn't mean he doesn't have characteristics and qualities that are ones that we could recognize as human, right? Even though he's presented as inhuman, and I say recognize as human, meaning not necessarily only positive ones, but in his case negative ones, like the desire for revenge, right? The desire to get back at Antonio and the others for the way they've treated him, which is completely human and natural, and understandable.
Right. Stay with the Caskets for a moment. Freud famously wrote an essay about the three chests, but clearly he was more interested in
the choice among three, right?
The choice, it was more interested in King Lear, because he skips off as soon as he can to talk about the three daughters.
Yeah.
But before he does that, he distinguishes the three caskets as representing projections of three different possible wives from which the suitors have to choose. So let me just read you the legends that accompany each of the caskets. And this is what I wonder about, what Dad had in mind with these three, because presumably this is his tournament of the chests. Gold. Who chooseth me shall gain what many men desire. And when Morocco opens it, it's all that glisters is not gold. Silver. Who chooseth me shall get as much as he deserves. And that's, is it Aragon?
Mm-hmm.
The chest tells him that he's too young and foolish, that he fell for the silver. And then we have lead. Who chooseth me must give and hazard all he hath. And as he's choosing it, Bassanio says, thy paleness moves me more than eloquence. Thy paleness, the paleness of the chest itself. So how Christian was it, if it's Christian at all, of Portia's father to have assigned the winning chest to lead, to plainness? Is that somehow representative of Christian virtue, of chastity, of plain spokenness? Bassanio says, thy paleness moves me more than eloquence. To follow Freud, if that's a projection of a possible wife, then that means that he hopes not to be Petruchio and married to someone who just doesn't know when to shut up. It has to be more than that. And the follow-up question to that is, the legend for gold and silver talk about get. Shall get as much as he deserves, shall gain what many desire. But lead is, who chooseth me must give and hazard all he hath. And I'm just wondering if that relates somehow to the idea of mercy.
Yeah. I think the lead casket is a way of talking about that what matters most is the inner virtue rather than the outer appearance. I think in his work, Shakespeare often reflects on this, right? The difference between a pleasing appearance that can mask a destructive or unpleasing inner person, right? A virtuous appearance can mask vice, right? And vice versa, right? A plain appearance can also mask virtue. So I think one interpretation of the lead casket is that it's the person who chooses that casket recognizes that first of all, everything is not what it seems, but what that matters most is the inner beauty, right? I guess that would be, from a Christian standpoint, being interpreted as virtue, right? So that could be Christian. And that the fact that somebody who chooses that must hazard all. It seems to me that to recognize a person's inner virtue requires a kind of level of relationship and intimacy that requires venturing or all, right, in order for someone to disclose it, right? People with inner virtue don't necessarily, by definition, wear it on their sleeve, right? So you would have to get to know it. It would take time to get to know a person's inner life, right? It would take a great investment of your energy, not something that you would just be handed to you easily, right? So maybe that's a way of looking at venturing all. I think the gold is more obvious, that it's about worldly wealth and the worldly appearance of things, right? That most get what they deserve. You can earn wealth, right? And that's one of the questions in the play, right? The earning and getting of wealth. And Bassanio talks also about the paleness of the lead casket being more eloquent. I think the silver casket is about how one can be deceived by the eloquence of language, right? That whereas the gold is worldly wealth, the silver casket might very well be the deceptions that gilded words can persuade people of virtue while still there being a false interiority to that, right? I think in either case, the silver and the gold, the appearance does not match what's within, right? But also, you get what you deserve, right? I mean, I would link this to Antonio, right? He's lived his life as a merchant. He's lived his life in the acquisition of wealth. Living his life pursuing wealth means that he's put his energies into those things and maybe not put his energies into the kinds of emotional satisfaction that he might get in a romantic relationship, which would link to my first interpretation that I offered before about how Antonio is a kind of alienated figure, right? Who has devoted himself to wealth and gets what he deserves.
It's also gold and silver make money.
Yeah, both of them. I mean, eloquence of words can make your money too, right? Politics and being able to persuade people of truth, right? And can also, by association, make you a lot of money. Right? Which is true in our day, true in Shakespeare's, right?
But here's what I don't get about the lead and about her father and about the meaning of the choice. Any of these guys coming to Belmont or Belmonte, they're not arriving on the basis of some estimation of an interior beauty of soul.
Right.
They don't know anything about that. All they know is that there's this gorgeous chick who's got lots of money.
Yeah.
And Bassanio as well.
Yeah.
This idea that who chooses the lead is not after the gold. Why the hell are they there if they're not after the gold? I mean, she's the gold. She's the wealthy princess of this domain. So, as you say, luckily for her, she's obviously in some way controlling this whole thing. And I think I've even seen an interpretation where she kind of does tip him off. I forget how. They invent a song for her where she mentions lead or she puts a candle in a certain place. Clearly, she remembers him from when he came to visit, and she's interested in him. And clearly, he remembers her, and it's a done deal.
So maybe the whole notion of a patriarchal authority and patriarchal power from beyond the grave is a ruse, too. Maybe Portia's father, aware of her ability, aware, as he must have been, of her intelligence, gives her the opportunity to make her choice.
Oh, I never thought of that. So he's making it look as if he has designated
Well, he has
who it
to,
is so that she can make
because
that
he
plea.
has to ensure succession. So he's created a ruse that will give her power.
So he's giving her the ability to say, this is the way Dad wanted it.
She's choosing the one she wants.
That really does relate to King Lear, doesn't it?
Lear has set it up so that Cordelia has the power. It's very clear in Lear, in the opening act, that they bring out one crown, right, and one coronet, right? And that's because he has chosen that Cordelia will have the central part of the kingdom, which effectively gives her control of all of it. So he has set it up, not that he's dividing it into three. He's giving it to Cordelia, who will have control over her sisters, because she'll have the central part of the kingdom.
He would have to have known that in advance because
Otherwise,
he's
there
already
would have
given
been
out
three crowns.
Right.
There's only one.
Right. And
So he tries to ensure succession.
And he's also already given out 2 pieces of the map. But the largest piece is supposed to go to the person.
The largest and the one in the center, because it allows her to maintain control. So, and Shakespeare would know this. He does this in Henry IV, Part 1. Once all the nobles, Northumberland and the others rebel, they've got a map on the table. And they're choosing, I want this portion because it's the richest land, right? That's part of Shakespeare's thinking elsewhere. So I think Lear tries to do perhaps what Portia's father successfully does, except Lear's mistake, and what makes it tragic, is that he doesn't include her in the plot. And then she doesn't play along, right? He expects her, he doesn't necessarily expect her to be the most eloquent. He will simply say she's the most eloquent, no matter what she says, and she foils the whole thing by refusing to say anything. And she makes it so obvious that she won't play the game that he can't move forward with his plan. So why wouldn't Portia's father basically ensure that she'll be able to make the choice of the right man? It's plausible. There's no evidence in the text, but the text doesn't rule it out. And anyway, it's a silly game anyway. What makes it impossible for a crafty suitor to understand that a game is being played here and choose lead because they figured it out intellectually? Nothing. So you wonder exactly what's going on there. And there have been dozens of suitors, right? She's naming like 6 in the first act, and then we have 2 more. 3, including Bassanio, right? So this has been one after another in succession. None of them have chosen lead. Right, exactly. Right.
It's also interesting from point of view of the absent father that a rider to this tournament, in a sense, what you have to put into the pot is that you agree that if you failed, you leave, you don't ever try again, and you never marry.
Marry anyone. Right.
So is that a way of saying you can't even play unless you pay? I don't know how it would be policed. You don't have the marriage police going back to
right.
France.
Yeah,
and
they're just
so it's
making presumably a promise that they'll
promise.
never marry. Yeah.
But again, I just somehow see this extremely self-righteous father who decides that if you have not chosen correctly and you're therefore not good enough for Portia, then you're not good enough for any woman. Stay a bachelor.
Right.
Stay single.
Right. Well, that does seem to be part of it.
But I like more your idea that she's concocted this. She's very smart. I mean, she's smart enough to do what she does in the courtroom. She could be smart enough. It's Bassanio that I'm waiting for, and, hopefully he'll come before I have 4 more suitors that I have to get rid of. And when he gets here...
Yeah, and I mean, it doesn't rule out the idea that fathers want their daughters to have the right marriage partners. And it's not necessarily out of the range of possibility that Portia's father recognizes her intelligence and gives her ability to choose. Why not?
We have to remember that Portia was played by a man who played her as a woman playing a man. So it always makes me wonder whether these young actors tried to play a woman playing a man or whether they just came on as themselves and just did the scene. It would make it a hell of a lot easier if they skipped the middle step. Mm-hmm. But you just did what a good actress would do for Portia. She would write her own backstory in order to make her character interesting and in order to represent it in a way that she could connect with. Mm-hmm. So if I were playing Antonio, I would probably say, over the last 400 years, could no one imagine why I might have hated and had contempt for Shylock, for any money lender, without necessarily hating him because he's Jewish? Mm-hmm. How about if I've seen him treating his debtors abominably? What if I've seen him tossing families, widows with their children, out of their houses? At one point, Antonio even says he resents me because I have relieved his forfeitures. That could suggest a whole world of Shylock on some level hoping that they would forfeit. We have to remember, too, they're probably Christians. Maybe he's thrown them out. Maybe he loves to see them suffer. Maybe he wants to see them grovel. Maybe he wants them to be jailed. Mm-hmm. If you ask me for what evidence I have for that as Antonio, I would say 2 things. First of all, what's the only thing that we see of Shylock, the only case, the one single case? How does he deal with a forfeiture? He wants to cut Antonio's heart out. So in terms of what in theater we call the given circumstances, the given circumstances for Shylock is that that's what he does. That's what he does. We never see him doing anything else. Secondly, I would say, make it contemporary and tell me what affection we have, what admiration we have for any entity that loans money. How do we feel about credit card companies? How do we feel about banks? How do we feel about loan sharks? Mm-hmm. They're bone crushers. Mm-hmm. They're leg breakers. For all we know, Shylock's got his own Goodfellas. Mm-hmm. After all, they're all Italians. Mm-hmm. Okay, we don't. That's how I would build my backstory.
Right.
I could spit on his gabardines without feeling that way because he's Jewish. And I would give you a third argument. If I'm so anti-Semitic as Antonio, why is there not a word from me or from any of my compadres about Jessica? Mm-hmm. We welcome her into the fold. She's marrying Lorenzo. It doesn't matter that she's converting. We have conversos all over Venice. Shakespeare had them all over London, Catholics, Jews. No one really believed that. You say you're converting, but if you're Jewish, you can't really anyway. It's because we don't care. Mm-hmm. Gratiano, who makes a joke when Lorenzo arrives, and he says, here's Lorenzo with his infidel. Mm-hmm. And that's not a nasty comment. It's just a high-spirited jest. Mm-hmm. Here he is with his wife.
What you're asking is there reasons for Antonio to hate Shylock that have nothing to do with his Jewishness.
My ventures are not in one place. No. Goddamn. Nor in one place, nor to one place. Believe me, no. My ventures are not in one... No. I thank my fortune for it. Nor is my... Nor... No. Believe me. Believe me, no. I don't even know if that's right. My fortunes are not... My... Ventures are not in one bottom. Okay. Nor in one place. It's just stupid. I feel like such a bozo with this particular explanation. It's like, no, no. So smug. Nor is my whole estate upon... Ay, ay, ay.
It'd be great if you included that.
Believe me. Believe me. No. Believe me. No. My... Believe me. No. My...
Believe me.
Believe me. No. Nor is my entire estate upon the... Son of a bitch. My ventures are not up... Christ, what is it with these fucking words? Upon the fortune of this present year.